it's increasingly difficult to imagine that the conversation that's defining the run-up to the election, a conversation that appears to be, broadly speaking, globalism versus nationalism, you could make that claim, that it can't just be about matters of dominion. They must be about matters of spirit on some level. Now, prior to us talking, you may have seen the video, perhaps we'll have posted some of it on social media by now, where Jordan and I were discussing that on some level, everything is symbolic. And Doctor, you gave examples from your clinical career of how an elevator could become a sepulchre, that a generalized bravery might be derived from confronting a personal demon. Therefore, archetypally, I ask, what is playing out in this clash of collisions where there is a total bifurcation of narratives, both sides making extraordinary claims about the other, the Trump's detractors claiming him demonic, tyrannical, despotic, the detractors of globalism and those kind of bureaucracies, I suppose that would include both of us, saying that this could be an inflection point where free speech, perpetual war and citizen management accelerate into an unprecedented terrain if the Democrats are successful in this election. So with those two poles, what do you think is ulteriorly playing out? Well, how can we apply the Jordan Peterson of archetypal analysis to this particular clash?
Well, I think probably the simplest way to understand this at the moment is that the fact of universal connectivity and the fact of rate of technological change and information interchange has made the underlying contours of social interaction more starkly clear. So I would say the same thing is happening that's always happened, but way faster.
Yes.
Way faster. And so in a way it's clearer, because when something is moving very slow, it might be hard to see that it's moving at all, but things are moving very fast now. And so I think what that means is that we can see things that we couldn't see before, or we can see them more clearly when we kind of had to darkly intuit them before. Now, there's always been an idea that behind the facade, there's an eternal spiritual battle. That's an ancient idea. And it's an idea that's easily deridable and has been, I suppose, since the dawn of the Enlightenment as a superstitious conception of the world. But it doesn't appear to me that it is a superstitious concept at all. It's an indication of the fact that things have a pattern, and there are patterns that are eternal, and eternal patterns play themselves out in the proximal at every moment, even invisibly. Well, it's not so invisible at the moment. And I think this is right. I think it's true.
And also, all that is gross must have had a subtler precedent that all gross matter must have been preceded by some nascent form of itself, a kind of fractal outpouring. Realities aren't just going to sort of blob into reality complete. So the idea that prior to the observable and the discernible, which by definition are that which can be detected sensorially, that there was an existence a priori, or at least before it became observable, is not a ridiculous claim at all. All we're doing is quarrelling about the semantics. Was there a creator? Was there a pre-form? Was there an unmanifest? I reckon we could jump between a few disciplines, physics, quantum physics, theology, and find that paradigm somewhat consistent. The alternative would be ridiculous. It's only when we become, like what I've started to observe myself, and it's really helped me reading a Christian apologist whose name is Joseph Boot. He used a brilliant, there's a lot of Jungian reiteration, rhymes and alliterations in this bit, and even the repetition of an image. He used the famous paragraph, in fact, page that precedes Orwell's much repeated, if you want to envisage the future of humanity, see a boot stamping on the human face forever. The passage before that, the whole page before that, Jordan, is incredible. Man and woman will be separated from one another. Families will be separated. There will be no distinction between beauty and ugliness. Now, I discussed this recently with Tucker Carlson, and he deduced that Orwell, as an Englishman, he believes was not proselytizing about or projecting a dystopian or a further dystopian incarnation of Soviet communism, but he was in fact pondering, projecting, reflecting, imagining what social democracy, such as the one he lived in, obviously Britain, might become in time. And I've read some analysis lately that sort of offers us that social democracies will always become tyrannical, and indeed that does seem to be the trajectory. We're not looking, in fact, at 20th century forms of despotism like communism and fascism. What we're seeing is sort of liberalism oddly morphing into tyranny, and we're at the point where all of these bizarre and ironically Orwellian contradictions, like in terms of the use of language, freedom is captivity and all of that, we're watching it happen in actual real time. And just before I conclude, that what I enjoyed when reading the analysis, or at least just the citing of all of that Orwell passage in Joseph Booth's book, I think it's called Mission of God, was that when you stamp on a human face forever, it's not just the desecration of something beautiful. Whose likeness are we made in? What is it you are destroying when you stamp on the face? And what is the function of totalitarianism? And what is a prerequisite of true totalitarianism? The annihilation of removal of God, because you cannot have true annihilation if the divine principle remains. It's only when you absolutely secularize, materialize, rationalize that human power can, if it indeed is, because remember, I'm asking you if you think there's an occultist undergirding, can fully, because it might be human, we might sort of rational, might become evil at some point in this conversation. They might become synonyms. I wonder, particularly if we are fallen, where did we fall to? So what I sort of sensed, what I understood from that, what was explained to me, was that these totalitarian globalist ideas have as a prerequisite the annihilation of God, so that God's power, God's principles, the unity that's implicit in any sacrament is annihilated. And can therefore be replaced by human power. And now they lay claim to the powers of the God that they have destroyed.
Okay. So let me take that apart.
Let's be honest. Most K-Cup pods are serving you mouldy, pesticide-laden rubbish. Chains like Dunkin', they're stinking the place out with their stale coffee and expecting you to say cheers. 1775 Coffee makes sure you don't have to drink a chemical soup when you want a caffeine lift. 1775 Coffee steps in to slap the mediocrity right out of the competition. Their K-Cup pods are filled with single origin, high-altitude beans, hand-picked by people who know what flavour actually is. It's coffee that will slap your brain fast awake. Faster, in fact, than a government scandal. Who doesn't need an injection of this new caffeine inflection? Kamala Biden? Get this stuff down you. You've got a choice of medium roast, dark roast, and mushroom blend. Yeah, actual mushrooms like lion's mane and reishi to boost your brain power as well as giving you an immediate lift. Because let's be honest, if your coffee isn't strong enough to overthrow a small government, what's the point? This coffee is for people who don't want a participation trophy. This is coffee for winners. Go to 1775coffee.com, grab your 24-pack and tell Corporate Coffee to take a hike. That's go to 1775coffee.com, grab your 24-pack and tell Corporate Coffee to take a hike. Caffeine that will help you overthrow the powerful.
So the first thing I would say is the reason that Cain kills Abel is to attain revenge on God. Because Abel is God's favorite. So the proximal target is Cain, but the distal target is definitely God. Okay, so, right, I'll show you. That's the motivation of Cain. Cain is rejected by God because his sacrifices are insufficient. We're not exactly sure why. It's not specified in the story. It's intimated that Cain could do better if he chose to, but he decided not to, and he knew it, and he knew what that would result in, and he invited in the temptation to become bitter about it instead of changing in the face of his failure. And he knows that, and he knows why, that's why he's suffering. And God tells him that, and instead of changing and repenting, even though he's being informed by the divine itself, even though he knows that, he kills Cain. And he does that despite God. And he triggers off a chain that starts with murder and ends with genocide and the flood. Right. Brutal. Okay, so that's one answer to the propositions you put forward. Another is the story of the Tower of Babel, which is what happens right after the flood. You might say that the world deteriorates in two ways when the divine is offended. And one is chaos floods back, that's the flood. And the other is that alternative conceptions of power emerge. That's the Tower of Babel. So it's the engineers who build the Tower of Babel. It's the descendants of Cain who build the Tower of Babel, fundamentally. The people who are off the divine path, and they build alternative conceptualizations of the divine that are secularized. These Tower of Babel constructions, the ziggurats that are referred to in the text, were towers that were built for the self-aggrandization of secular leaders. So they were testaments to their own deification. Right. And the consequence of that, according to the text, is that if you build a false tower skyward, you will confuse yourself so badly that words themselves will lose all their reference. Right. People will be unable to agree on what constitutes a man and what constitutes a woman. And that is a fundamental disruption, because I believe, as a psychologist, that there is no more fundamental perceptual category, not just conceptual. There's no more fundamental perceptual category than man and woman. Sex is 650 million years old. It's older than trees. The distinction between male and female is more fundamental than the distinction between up and down, or black and white, or dark and light. And so if you can confuse people so badly that they don't know the difference between a man and a woman, the Tower of Babel has stretched to the sky, and people are unable to understand one another. And that's what happens in the story of the Tower of Babel. It's traditionally often interpreted as what would you say, just so story about the origin of multiple languages. So I don't think that's what it means at all. It means that if you disturb the underlying metaphysics sufficiently, if you build your temples to the wrong gods, you will confuse people in precise proportion to the misalignment of your aim. And if you do that with the ultimate in presumption, you'll confuse people so bad that their words will no longer have meaning, no longer have shared meaning. And it seems to me that's an archetypal pattern. There's two ways a state can degenerate, let's say. Flood way, which is everything's wiped out in an orgy of chaos, and the totalitarian way, which is that we build these false monuments, we build these presumptuous monuments to false gods and degenerate into a totalitarian stagnation. And of course, that eventually falls as well. But those are the patterns. Too much order. That's the Tower of Babel pattern. Too much chaos. That's the flood pattern. It's like, yeah, of course. Of course, that's what's going to happen when you miss a line and you're not balancing those two forces, obviously. And it's a consequence of pride in the Tower of Babel situation. That's Lucifer again. It's the same Lucifer, symbolically speaking, who's behind the sin of Eve and the sin of Adam, and the presumption of Cain, for that matter.
Our new The Oracle series, our first ever group interviews designed to bring the greatest and most authoritative voices in particular subjects together for the very first time. Robert Malone, Dr. Pierre Corey, and Steve Kirsch.
What we've experienced is a globally deployed psychological bioterrorism playbook. It's well developed.
And then I started to see just global propaganda directed at essentially distorting, dismissing, and suppressing the evidence of efficacy. And I saw it as a crime.
And at that point, I knew that this was not just a coincidence. There were too many black swans over too short a period. I've never heard anything like this story in my life.
They seem to get the human psyche so well when it comes to brainwashing us and propagandizing us to the direction that they want us to go in, that you would think that they would know that pulling all of these various tactics would actually just push support towards Trump, not away from him.
Ryan Ruth, some of his posts even show that he appeared to have been working with, in his own words, the U.S. Embassy in Kiev. He's doing effectively military intelligence, human trafficking of terrorists.
It's in this context that I think Ruth was kind of radicalized. He decided decided that while he wanted to assassinate Putin, the easier thing would be to assassinate Donald Trump.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to see more uncensored content where free speech can flourish, join our live stream. Click the link right here to watch the next video if you want to, or become a member of a growing movement. Download the Rumble app and you'll be informed every time we make a new piece of content. Stay free.